Man gives homeless woman a coat, discovers she's his missing sister. Life has a way of throwing unexpected moments at us. Moments that seem small at first, but ripple outward, changing everything. This story is about one such moment, a twist of fate so unbelievable, it feels like it was written in the stars. It's about a man named Daniel who thought he was simply helping a stranger on a cold winter day, only to uncover a truth that would shake him to his core. Daniel was just like any of us, a man caught in the grind of everyday life, juggling responsibilities, trying to keep his head above water. His days were filled with meetings, deadlines, and endless phone calls, and in the midst of it all, a quiet sadness had settled into his life. It wasn't the kind of sadness that people noticed, not the kind that could be explained easily. It was subtle, but constant, like a shadow following him wherever he went. That shadow had a name: Emily. Emily was Daniel's younger sister, the light of his family. She had been full of life, the kind of person who could brighten a room just by walking into it. But all of that had been taken away in an instant. Years ago, Emily had disappeared without a trace. One moment she was there, laughing and joking with her family, and the next she was gone. Daniel had replayed the day she vanished 1,000 times in his mind, searching for answers, wondering what he could have done differently. Despite years of searching, of putting up flyers and following leads, no trace of Emily had ever been found. Not a day went by that Daniel didn't think of her. He often found himself wondering where she was, if she was safe, if she even remembered him. He held on to hope because that was all he had left. But as the years stretched on, that hope grew harder to cling to. Still, he never stopped looking for her. Not really. Even when he wasn't actively searching, he was always scanning faces in crowds, his heart skipping a beat whenever he saw someone who looked even remotely like her. On a particularly cold winter day, Daniel was walking home from work. The streets were bustling with people, all bundled up in coats and scarves, their heads down as they hurried to escape the biting wind. Snow clung to the edges of the sidewalks, and the air was heavy with the smell of exhaust and melting ice. Daniel barely noticed any of it. His mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with thoughts of the upcoming holidays. For most people, the holidays were a time of joy and celebration, but for Daniel, they were bittersweet. Every holiday was a reminder of Emily's absence, of the empty seat at the table, and the memories they would never get to make. As he turned a corner, something caught his eye. A figure huddled on the sidewalk, wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket. It was a woman, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, her face hidden beneath a mess of unwashed hair. Around her, people walked by without so much as a glance, their hurried steps echoing against the cold pavement. Daniel hesitated for a moment, caught between his own discomfort and the nagging feeling that he couldn't just walk away. He had seen homeless people before. Living in a city, it was impossible not to, but there was something about this woman that stopped him in his tracks. She looked so small, so fragile, like the world had beaten her down and left her there to freeze. Her hands were trembling as she tried to pull the blanket tighter around herself, and Daniel could see that her shoes were falling apart, her toes barely protected from the cold. His chest tightened. He couldn't keep walking. He just couldn't. Without thinking, Daniel approached her. He crouched down, his breath visible in the icy air as he pulled off his own coat. It wasn't much, just a simple black winter coat he had bought on sale years ago, but it was warm, and it was the best he could offer in that moment. The woman looked up as he draped the coat over her shoulders, her eyes wide with surprise. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Daniel felt a strange jolt in his chest. There was something about her gaze that seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "You look like you need this more than I do," he said softly, his voice warm but tentative. The woman stared at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she mumbled a quiet, "Thank you," her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. Daniel smiled gently, trying to reassure her. "Take care of yourself," he said, standing up and slipping his hands into his pockets. He walked away, the cold biting at him now that he was without his coat. But he didn't mind. It felt good to have done something kind, even if it was small. But as he continued down the street, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about the woman on the street. Her face, her voice. It lingered in his mind, refusing to let him rest. He replayed the moment they locked eyes, trying to figure out why she felt so familiar. It was like a memory he couldn't quite grasp, just out of reach. And then, like a flash of lightning, it hit him. Her eyes. They were Emily's eyes. Daniel sat bolt upright, his heart pounding in his chest. Could it really be her? Could that woman sitting on the cold pavement be his sister? It seemed impossible, but the thought refused to leave his mind. He had to know. He had to go back. And so, with his heart racing and his mind filled with questions, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, Daniel awoke with a determination he hadn't felt in years. His heart still raced from the revelation that had struck him the night before. Could the woman on the street really have been Emily? The thought seemed absurd. How could his sister, the vibrant, joyful girl who had once lit up their family, be the same woman he'd seen shivering on the pavement, her face lined with exhaustion? And yet, the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became. Those eyes, they were unmistakable. No amount of time or hardship could erase the familiarity he had seen in them. Daniel spent the morning replaying the encounter in his mind, analyzing every detail. Her posture, the way she mumbled her thanks, the subtle tilt of her head. He couldn't believe he hadn't noticed it sooner. His chest tightened with a mix of hope and guilt. If it was Emily, how had he not recognized her immediately? And if it wasn't her, then why couldn't he shake the feeling that it was? He didn't care how cold it was or how busy his day was supposed to be. He had to go back. He had to find her. Throwing on a spare coat and scarf, Daniel left his apartment and headed straight for the street corner where he had seen her. The wind was bitter, slicing through the layers of clothing he had hastily thrown on, but he didn't care. His pace quickened as he approached the spot, his eyes scanning the sidewalk for any sign of her. When he reached the corner, his heart sank. The woman was gone. The patch of pavement where she had sat the day before was empty, the blanket she had clung to nowhere in sight. He looked around, his gaze darting to every nearby doorway and alley, but there was no trace of her. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. What if he had been wrong? What if he had missed his only chance to find her? But Daniel wasn't ready to give up. He began asking around, approaching the street vendors and other homeless individuals in the area. "Did you see a woman sitting here yesterday?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Thin, dark hair, wearing an old blanket. "I gave her my coat. Did you see where she went?" Most people shook their heads or shrugged, uninterested in helping a stranger. But finally, an older man sitting on an overturned crate spoke up. "Yeah, I saw her," he said, his voice rough and gravelly. "She usually hangs out a few blocks down near the old shelter, but she doesn't stick around long. Moves a lot." Daniel felt a surge of hope. "Thank you," he said quickly, handing the man a few bills before rushing off in the direction he had pointed. His heart pounded as he walked, every step bringing a mixture of hope and fear. What if he found her and it wasn't Emily? Or worse, what if he didn't find her at all? The area around the shelter was even colder, the wind whipping through the narrow streets lined with boarded-up buildings. Daniel scanned every corner, every doorway, his breath visible in the icy air. And then, just as he was about to give up, he saw her. She was sitting on the steps of the old shelter, her head down, her thin frame wrapped in his coat. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was her. He was sure of it. Slowly he approached, his hands trembling as he reached into his pocket for a photograph he had carried for years, a picture of Emily from before she disappeared. It was slightly worn from being handled so often, but the image of her bright smile was still clear. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice shaking. The woman looked up, startled, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel held out the photograph, his hand unsteady. "Is your name Emily?" Her reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened, her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she stared at the photograph, her hand slowly reaching out to take it. When her fingers brushed against the picture, her expression crumbled. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she nodded, barely able to whisper, "Yes." Daniel felt the air leave his lungs, his knees threatening to give out beneath him. It was her. It was really her. "Emily," he said, his voice breaking. "It's me. It's Daniel." Emily stared at him, her face a mixture of disbelief and fear. "Daniel," she repeated, as if the name were a distant memory. Her voice cracked and tears spilled down her cheeks. I thought I'd never see you again." Daniel dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands shaking as he reached out to her. "It's me," he said again, his own tears falling freely now. "It's really me. I've been looking for you for so long." Emily hesitated for a moment, as if she didn't trust what she was seeing, but then she leaned forward and collapsed into his arms. The years of separation, the pain and guilt, the questions that had haunted them both, all of it came pouring out in the form of broken sobs. Daniel held her tightly, as if afraid that if he let go, she might disappear again. For what felt like an eternity, they stayed there on the shelter steps, clinging to each other as the world moved around them. Daniel could feel the weight of her frail body in his arms, the coldness of her skin even through his coat. He whispered her name over and over, as if trying to convince himself that this moment was real. Finally, Emily pulled back slightly, her tear-streaked face filled with a mix of relief and shame. "I didn't think you'd want to see me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been through so much, Daniel. I didn't think I could ever come back." Daniel shook his head, his hands gently gripping her shoulders. "You're my sister," he said firmly. "Nothing will ever change that. I don't care what's happened or where you've been. I'm just glad I found you." Emily's tears flowed freely again as she nodded, her hands clutching at the edges of his coat. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to the life she had lost. And for Daniel, the moment he had prayed for every single day since she disappeared had finally arrived. But this was only the beginning. There was still so much he didn't know, and he was determined to uncover the truth about what had happened to his sister. Together, they would face whatever came next, no matter how difficult the journey ahead. As Daniel and Emily sat together on the shelter steps, the weight of the moment pressed down on them. The shock of their reunion left them speechless for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Daniel couldn't stop staring at her, trying to reconcile the image of the sister he remembered with the woman sitting before him. Her face was thinner now, her eyes weary, but there was no mistaking it. It was her. Emily. His Emily. "Emily," he began softly, breaking the silence. "What happened to you? Where have you been all these years?" Emily lowered her gaze, her hands trembling as they clutched the coat around her. Her shoulders rose and fell with a shaky breath. It's a long story, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I've got time, Daniel replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, urging her to continue. I want to know everything. Please, Emily. She hesitated, her eyes darting around as if afraid someone might overhear. But then, as if the floodgates had opened, she began to speak. Her words were halting at first, but soon they poured out, each one heavier than the last. It started the day I left, Emily said, her voice cracking. I was so angry, Daniel. Do you remember? I thought I didn't need anyone, that I could figure it all out on my own, but I was wrong. So wrong. Daniel nodded, his heart aching as he remembered the night she disappeared. She had stormed out after a heated argument with their parents, slamming the door behind her. He had wanted to go after her, but their father had stopped him, saying, "She just needs time to cool off. She'll come back." Except she hadn't. I thought I could make it on my own, Emily continued. I found some people who said they could help me. Friends, or at least that's what I thought they were. But they weren't. They took advantage of me, Daniel. They made me believe I didn't have a choice, and before I knew it, I was trapped. Her voice broke, and she turned her face away, tears spilling down her cheeks. Daniel felt a surge of anger and protectiveness. He didn't need her to say more to know what she meant. Whoever these people were, they had hurt her, manipulated her, and torn her away from the life she deserved. I tried to get away, she said after a moment, her voice barely audible. I really did. But it was hard. Every time I thought I was free, something would pull me back. I ended up moving from place to place, losing more of myself each time. And then one day, I just gave up. I told myself it was easier to disappear, to stop hoping. That's how I ended up here. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, to tell her how sorry he was, how much he wished he could have been there to protect her. But he knew that words wouldn't change the past. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. You don't have to do this alone anymore, he said firmly. You're not alone, Emily. I'm here now. For the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to believe that might be true. She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face softening as she saw the determination in his eyes. I didn't think anyone would want me back, she admitted. Not after everything I've been through. Daniel shook his head, his voice steady and full of conviction. You're my sister. That's all that matters. Whatever happened, we'll get through it together, I promise. Emily nodded slowly, her lips trembling as a fresh wave of tears spilled over. It wasn't just the relief of being found, it was the realization that someone still cared, that she hadn't been forgotten. For so long she had felt invisible, like a ghost wandering through a world that no longer saw her. But now, for the first time in years, she felt seen. As they sat there, a light snow began to fall, dusting the streets and rooftops around them. It was quiet, almost peaceful, and for a moment they simply sat together, letting the gravity of their reunion sink in. But Daniel knew this was just the beginning. There was so much to be done, so many questions that still needed answers. Come with me, Daniel said after a while. Let me take you home. We'll get you cleaned up, get you some food, and then we can figure out what's next. Emily hesitated, glancing down at her worn, dirt-streaked clothes. I don't know, Daniel, she said softly. I don't even know if I remember what home feels like anymore. Home is wherever we're together, Daniel replied, his voice unwavering. and I'll do whatever it takes to make you feel safe again. Please, Emily. Let me help you." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." Daniel helped her to her feet, his arms steadying her as they began walking. The journey back to his apartment was quiet, but heavy with emotion. Emily clung to the coat he had given her, her steps unsteady but determined. She wasn't sure what awaited her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. When they arrived, Daniel guided her inside and immediately set to work. He gave her fresh clothes, a warm blanket, and a bowl of soup, the steam rising in the dim light of the kitchen. Emily ate slowly, her hands trembling as she held the spoon. It wasn't just the food or the warmth. It was the feeling of being cared for, of being seen as more than just another nameless face on the street. As the hours passed, Daniel began to see glimpses of the sister he remembered. There were still shadows in her eyes, scars that told stories she hadn't yet shared, but there was also something else: strength. Emily had endured so much more than he could imagine, and yet she was still here. She was still fighting, even if she didn't realize it. That night, as she lay on his couch wrapped in blankets, Daniel sat nearby, watching over her. He couldn't stop thinking about how close he had come to walking away that day on the street. If he had taken one step past her, if he hadn't stopped to offer his coat, he might never have known. The thought chilled him to the core. In the quiet of the night, Daniel made a silent vow. He would do everything in his power to help his sister rebuild her life, to give her the future she deserved. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: they would face them together. Because no matter how far Emily had fallen, no matter how much time had passed, she was still his sister, and he wasn't going to let her go again. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains of Daniel's apartment, casting a warm glow across the room. Emily stirred on the couch, her eyes fluttering open to unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment she panicked, her mind flashing back to years of waking up in cold, lonely places where safety was a luxury she couldn't afford. But then she saw Daniel, sitting in a chair nearby, and the tension melted away. He had stayed up all night, watching over her, as if afraid she might disappear again. "Morning," Daniel said softly, offering her a warm smile. He held out a steaming mug of coffee, its aroma filling the room. "How are you feeling?" Emily sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Her voice was hoarse as she replied, "Better, warmer, thank you." They sat in silence for a few moments, sipping their coffee. For Daniel, it felt surreal to have her here, sitting in his living room after so many years of not knowing where she was. For Emily, it felt like waking up from a nightmare, tentative and fragile, but with the faintest glimmer of hope. "Emily," Daniel began, breaking the silence. "There's so much I want to ask you, so much I want to know, but I don't want to push you. I need to understand what happened to you, why you didn't come back." Emily looked down at her mug, her fingers tracing its rim. She knew this moment would come, and part of her dreaded it. But another part of her, perhaps the part that had been waiting to be found, wanted to share her story, to finally unburden herself of the secrets she had carried for so long. "It wasn't that I didn't want to come back," she said finally, her voice trembling. "It's that I didn't think I could. After I left, things got bad. Really bad." She paused, her gaze distant as memories surfaced. "At first, I thought I could handle it. I thought I'd prove everyone wrong, show them I could take care of myself. But I was young, and I didn't know what I was getting into. I trusted the wrong people. They offered me help, a place to stay, but it came with strings I didn't understand until it was too late. Daniel's grip on his coffee mug tightened, his knuckles turning white. He didn't interrupt, but his heart ached with every word. "They controlled everything," Emily continued, her voice breaking. "Where I went, who I talked to, what I did. And when I tried to leave, they made sure I knew the consequences. It wasn't just fear that kept me there. It was shame. I didn't want you or Mom and Dad to see what I'd become." Daniel leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. "Emily, none of that matters. What matters is that you're here now. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand, Daniel. I thought I could start over, but every time I tried, I failed. I ended up on the streets, barely surviving, and I told myself it was what I deserved." Daniel's voice softened, filled with compassion. "No one deserves that, least of all you. You made mistakes, Emily, but that doesn't mean you're beyond help. It doesn't mean you don't deserve a second chance." Emily wiped her tears, her hands trembling. "I want to believe that," she whispered. "I really do, but I don't even know where to start." Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You start by letting me help you, one step at a time. We'll figure this out together." Over the next few days, Daniel poured all his energy into helping Emily. He contacted local organizations that offered support for people experiencing homelessness, connecting her with counselors and resources to help her rebuild her life. He made sure she had a warm, safe place to stay, fresh clothes, and regular meals. For Emily, the transition was overwhelming. After years of surviving on the streets, trusting no one, the sudden kindness and stability felt foreign. There were moments when she doubted herself, moments when she wanted to retreat into the shadows. But Daniel was always there, encouraging her, reminding her that she wasn't alone. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Daniel pulled out a box from the closet. Inside were photographs, keepsakes, and mementos from their childhood. Emily's eyes lit up as she sifted through them, her fingers tracing the edges of the photos. "Do you remember this?" Daniel asked, holding up a picture of the two of them at a carnival, cotton candy in hand and wide smiles on their faces. Emily laughed softly, the sound bittersweet. "I do. That was the day I got sick from eating too much candy, and you stayed up all night making sure I was okay." Daniel smiled. "That's what big brothers are for." For the first time in years, they shared a moment of genuine connection, their laughter filling the room. It wasn't just a step toward healing. It was a reminder of the bond they had always shared, a bond that time and distance could never truly break. But as Emily began to find her footing, Daniel couldn't shake a lingering question. Who were the people who had hurt her? And were they still out there? He wanted to protect her, to make sure she never had to look over her shoulder again. "Emily," he said one afternoon, his tone serious, "I need to know more about what happened. Not because I want to dredge up the past, but because I want to make sure they can't hurt you anymore." Emily hesitated, her expression darkening. "They're gone," she said finally. "At least I think they are. I left them behind years ago. I don't want to go back to that part of my life, Daniel. I just want to move forward." Daniel nodded, respecting her wishes. But in the back of his mind, he made a silent vow to ensure her safety. If there was any chance those people could still pose a threat, he would do whatever it took to protect her. In the weeks that followed, Emily began to flourish. She started attending counseling sessions, reconnecting with her sense of self, and rediscovering the dreams she had buried long ago. She even began volunteering at the very shelter where Daniel had found her, wanting to give back and help others who were struggling. One evening, as they sat on the balcony watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Emily turned to Daniel. "You saved me," she said softly. If you hadn't stopped that day, if you hadn't given me your coat, I don't know where I'd be." Daniel shook his head, his voice filled with emotion. "You saved yourself, Emily. I just gave you a push. You're stronger than you think, and I'm so proud of you." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow, they were tears of gratitude, of hope. For the first time in years, she felt like her life was her own again. And as the two of them sat there side by side, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. That night, after Emily's talk at the community center, the world felt different for both her and Daniel. As they walked home under a blanket of stars, the weight of the past felt lighter than it had in years. The journey they had taken together, from pain and loss to hope and healing, was one they would never forget. But more than that, it was a journey that had redefined who they were, not just to each other, but to themselves. When they got home, Emily curled up on the couch, her expression thoughtful. Daniel sat across from her, watching her quietly. He could see the change in her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, finding purpose in her pain and strength in her story. She was becoming the woman she was always meant to be. "You know," Emily said after a long silence, "I used to think the world had forgotten about me, that no one would ever care if I just disappeared. But today, hearing those people thank me, seeing their faces light up when I told my story, it made me realize something." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes filled with quiet encouragement. "What's that?" Emily smiled faintly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I mattered all along, even when I felt invisible, even when I thought I didn't deserve to be loved. I mattered. And if I can help just one person realize that about themselves, then everything I've been through will have been worth it." Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent years searching for her, years wondering if he would ever get the chance to tell her how much she meant to him. Now, hearing her say those words, he knew she was finally beginning to see herself the way he always had. "You've always mattered, Emily," Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly. "To me, to Mom and Dad, to everyone who loves you. And now you're showing other people that they matter too. That's the most incredible thing you could ever do." Emily nodded, her eyes shimmering with tears, but they were tears of gratitude, of hope. "You know," she said softly, "when you gave me your coat that day, it wasn't just about staying warm. It was the first time in years that someone saw me as more than just nothing. You reminded me that I was still a person, that I was still worth saving. I don't know if I can ever thank you enough for that." "You already have," Daniel replied, "by being here, by finding your strength again, by helping others. You've done more than I ever could have hoped for." For a while, they sat in silence, the quiet hum of the city outside their window, a gentle reminder of the world they were slowly stepping back into. Emily looked around the room, at the photographs on the walls, the small but cozy space Daniel called home. It was a far cry from the life she had known on the streets, and yet it wasn't just the physical warmth of the apartment that made it feel safe. It was the love that filled it, the bond they had rebuilt after years of separation. "You know," Emily said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about what's next." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want to do more," she said, her voice steady with determination. "Not just for myself, but for others. There are so many people out there who feel the way I did, lost, invisible, like they don't matter. I want to help them, Daniel. I want to show them that they can find their way back just like I did." Daniel felt his heart swell with pride. "That's an incredible idea, Emily. I think you could make a real difference." She nodded, her eyes shining with conviction. "I've spent too long feeling like a victim, like I didn't have control over my own life. But now I see that I can take everything I've been through, the pain, the mistakes, the struggles, and use it to help others. If I can be a light for even one person, then it's all worth it." Daniel reached out and took her hand, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "You're already a light, Emily. You always have been, and I'll be here to support you every step of the way." As the days turned into weeks, Emily began to take steps toward her new purpose. She started volunteering more regularly, sharing her story at shelters and community events, connecting with people who had felt invisible for far too long. Her words weren't just inspiring, they were transformative, offering hope to those who thought they had none. Meanwhile, Daniel watched her journey with a mixture of awe and gratitude. He had spent years searching for her, praying for her, hoping she was still out there somewhere. Now, seeing her rise from the ashes of her past, he realized that the person she was becoming was stronger, braver, and more resilient than he could have ever imagined. One evening, as they sat together reflecting on everything that had happened, Daniel turned to Emily with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "your story doesn't end here. It's just beginning. And I think you're going to do incredible things." Emily smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet confidence she hadn't felt in years. "And I think we're going to do incredible things," she replied, "because I couldn't have gotten here without you." And now, to you watching this video, let Emily's story remind you of something important. No one is ever too far gone. No matter how lost, broken, or invisible someone may feel, they still matter. And sometimes, all it takes is one small act of kindness to change everything. Maybe you're the one who needs to hear this. Maybe you've been struggling, wondering if you'll ever find your way back. If that's you, let Emily's journey remind you that there's always hope. Or maybe you're the person who can be someone else's light, the one who offers a smile, a helping hand, or a moment of compassion that could change a life. Either way, don't underestimate the power of love, connection, and resilience. Emily's story didn't end in darkness, and neither does yours. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about a time someone showed you kindness or how you've helped someone else. Let's keep spreading hope together. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Every week, we share tales that prove no matter how hard life gets, there's always a way forward. Because together, we can make the world a little brighter, one act of kindness at a time.